Good evening and welcome to Temple Beth Shalom's special event, An Evening with Ambassador Dennis Ross. I'm Debbie Haspel, and along with my husband Larry, we wish to thank the Jewish Federation of Sarasota Manatee for co-sponsoring this evening's program with us. There are very few people in the realm of American foreign policy with the knowledge and insight that Ambassador Ross has regarding the Middle East. Ambassador Ross is counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He also teaches at Georgetown University Center for Jewish Civilization. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross has played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties as the U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Prior to his service as Special Middle East Coordinator under President Clinton, Ambassador Ross served as Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff in the first Bush administration. He played a prominent role in U.S. policy towards the former Soviet Union, the unification of Germany and its integration into NATO, arms control negotiations, and the 1991 Gulf War Coalition. During the Reagan administration, he served as Director of the Near East and South Asian Affairs on the National Security Council staff and Deputy Director of the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. A graduate of UCLA, Ambassador Ross wrote his doctoral dissertation on Soviet decision-making and served as Executive Director of the Berkeley-Stanford Program on Soviet International Behavior. He received UCLA's highest medal and has been named UCLA Alumnus of the Year. Ambassador Ross is the author of 5 books on the peace process, the Middle East, and international relations, most recently, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny, written with his colleague David Makovsky, which was published in 2019. It provides profiles of 4 Israeli prime ministers who made historic choices and explores the lessons from those decisions to see if they can provide a clear guide to dealing with the fateful choice that Israel's leaders must soon confront, or by default, become a binational state. Previously, Ambassador Ross authored Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israel Relationship from Truman to Obama. That book was awarded the 2015 National Jewish Book Award for History. He also co-authored Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East with Mr. Makovsky. An earlier study, The Missing Piece, the inside story of the fight for Middle East peace, offers comprehensive analytical and personal insight into the Middle East peace process. The New York Times praised his 2007 publication, Statecraft and How to Restore America's Standing in the World as, quote, important and illuminating. Tonight, Ambassador Ross will discuss current events in the Middle East and also give us some insight into how our recent election could impact U.S. foreign policy in this challenging part of the world. Ambassador Ross will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. The Q&A portion of the program tonight will be moderated by Edie Chaffetz, and you can submit your questions by using the chat function on your screens. But please, in the interest of time, we do ask that you please submit only questions and not personal comments, opinions, or statements. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Dennis Ross.
You need to unmute, Ambassador.
This way you can hear me as well. My main regret is that I can't be there in person. I hope that at some point I can be. For now, everything we do in life seems to be virtual, but that doesn't prevent us from being able to have discussions in what is obviously an unusual time. I'm someone who was a political appointee for Ronald Reagan, for George H.W. Bush, for Bill Clinton, and for Barack Obama. And in the past, that was not unusual. Foreign policy was looked at as an issue where politics stopped at the water's edge. Now, it's obviously been some time since that was the case. And at some point, I hope we can see it again. And if you want to talk about the election and some of its implications, we can do that in the Q&A, because obviously I come at it from a perspective of someone who had 2 Republican presidents appoint him and 2 Democratic presidents appoint him as well. What I want to do tonight is focus on how the Middle East landscape is changing, so you can actually understand what's going on in terms of the current events in the region. I mean, there's obviously a wide array of different kinds of issues we can get into, but what I want to talk about in particular is the reality that the landscape between Sunni Arab states and Israel is changing fundamentally, and it will have a long-term strategic effect. It will certainly affect the Palestinians, and whether in fact they will adjust to what is a completely new reality, which at this point they haven't yet adjusted to, but they will need to look in the mirror and decide that if they don't adjust, they're going to be left behind. And I want to explain where this came from, in a sense, how it happened. The idea of the UAE producing normalization and peace with Israel, which was then followed by Bahrain and Sudan, may seem like it just happened, but it didn't. The UAE and the Sunni Arab states have been drawn towards the Israelis, at least below the radar screen, for about the last 12 to 13 years. And I'll tell you a little story to start with. In 2007, Condi Rice was the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, and she went to meet with the Gulf Cooperation Council states. There's 6 states there. The Saudis, the Emiratis, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman, and Kuwait. These are the Gulf Cooperation Council states. And Condi went and she sat with them, and she was going there because she'd made a decision to launch a major new initiative to try to make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And when she got there, this is 2007, the only thing they wanted to talk about was what was the surge in Iraq. This is when we were surging a number of forces in, supporting what was known then in Iraq as the Awakening Council, and Iran. In fact, she later described this in her memoir from being Secretary of State as, I wanted to talk about the Israelis and the Palestinians, and all they wanted to talk about was Iran, Iran, Iran. Now, around this same time, not surprisingly, there was a recognition on the part of many of these Sunni Arab states, especially the ones in the Gulf, that they shared the same strategic perspective as Israel. They saw the same threats, meaning from Iran, but also from the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda and so forth. And they began back then to create covert, quiet relationships under the table. In the case of the UAE, I can tell you that in February of 2009, right after the beginning of the Obama administration, and I was in the Obama administration, the first 6 months I spent in the State Department, and then I was asked to go to the White House by President Obama. And in February of 2009, I was invited to see the UAE ambassador to the United States, Yusuf Al-Taiba, who I will get back to because he's really the hero of the breakthrough now with Israel. And so I go there to see him February 2009. I open he greets me at the door. It was actually his hotel suite in the Ritz-Carlton in Washington, D.C. And who's standing next to him? Salai Meridor, Israel's ambassador to the United States. Clearly, this was a decision to send a message to the administration: we are together. We're working together. We see the threats the same way, and we want the Obama administration to recognize this as well, to recognize not only the threats that we see, but also to recognize that we're working together. That was 2009. In 2015, the Emiratis began to take this relationship and make it a bit more public. They allowed Israel to establish a diplomatic presence in Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates. The Emirates had made a decision, starting back in 2005, they were going to create renewable energy. Obviously, this is an oil-rich country. They saw it wasn't the basis for long-term health in terms of economic well-being, So they wanted to create alternative energy sources, renewable energy. They wanted to focus on environmental changes. And they invited the International Renewable Energy Agency, an international agency, a UN agency. They invited it to come to Abu Dhabi and establish an office. And they allowed the Israelis in 2015 to set up a diplomatic presence in the UAE. Technically, they drew a distinction. Okay, they're here as part of an international agency. They're not here in terms of a diplomatic presence vis-a-vis us. But that was a kind of interesting fiction. So here was a public Israeli presence in the Emirates. In 2017, they began to allow Israelis to participate in competitions, sports competitions, again, within the Emirates. 2 years in a row in one of the weight classes in judo competition, you had an Israeli win his weight class, and Hatikva was played publicly. You had the Minister of Culture and State from Israel go to Abu Dhabi and basically not just do interviews, but to do a walking tour of where she was in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai. So what you saw was a gradual process of normalization that was taking place. Again, taking what was below the radar screen and being prepared incrementally to make it visible. So why in the summer of 2020 did they decide to cross the threshold? They were normalizing anyway, but there was still a kind of limit as to what they were prepared to do and what they were prepared to admit that they were doing in public. So why did they do that? Actually, one of the things I like to do, I also teach, as Debbie said in the introduction, one of the things I like to do is I like to pose questions when I'm giving lectures or talks. One of the things you can always count on is I know the answer to my own questions. So why? Why did they do it in the summer of 2020? And the reason is because they were very concerned about Prime Minister Netanyahu's plan to annex the territories that were allotted to Israel in the Trump peace plan. Will, I would like you to share the screen right now, and I want you to show the Trump peace plan, and I'll explain a little bit more about it, and then again, why the Emirates made this decision to go ahead and annex now, and how the annexation declaration related to it. Okay, so when you look at what you see in the plan right here, you see the part of what would become a Palestinian state is what's in green. And so what you can see is that there are little areas that are really next to Gaza that would be, that are actually part of Israel, that would become part of the Palestinian state outside of Gaza, actually part of Israel. And then you can see that there is in the green area, you can see it's divided up with these little white areas. And the little white areas are where Israeli settlements are. What this would be a plan in which the green areas, as you can see, are completely surrounded by Israel. So there is no independent border with Jordan. The closest plan that had ever looked like this, you have to go back to 1970. Will, can you show the Alone Peace Plan? Okay, so here's the Alone Peace Plan. And what you'll see here is that the blue areas would not be part of the state. The blue areas would be what Israel would control. That's similar, by the way, to the Trump peace plan in the sense that this blue area is basically the Jordan Valley. From a security standpoint, and again, this was 1970, from a security standpoint, Israel believes and has long believed, and Yitzhak Rabin always called the Jordan River Israel's security border. This would continue to be part of Israel. But note, there's a corridor to Jordan. Unlike the Trump peace plan, there is no corridor to Jordan. And you'll also see, look at the green areas. The green areas are not divided up. They're contiguous. The division is, it's divided in half, but it's not, you don't see little enclaves built into it. The reason that there are enclaves built into the Trump plan is that the Trump peace plan would annex all of the Israeli settlements. Israel would it's not only that Israel wouldn't have to leave any settlements, it's that all the Israeli settlements would remain part of Israel. I can tell you when we were at Camp David, we came up with in the summer of 2000, we came up with a concept of settlement blocks and swaps. And the reason is that 85% of all the Israeli settlers live in an area close to the Green Line, in about 6%, 6 to 7% of the West Bank. So we came up with the concept of those areas will be absorbed into Israel. Could be up to 6, 7%, and there'll be compensation. Just as in the Trump peace plan, those areas next to Gaza, those are areas that are actually part of Israel that would be turned over to the Palestinians. Our concept was settlement blocks and swaps. We wanted to ensure that you could absorb the vast majority of settlers, but you could also separate Israelis from Palestinians. One of the potential problem areas with the Trump plan, let's go back to the Trump plan, Will. One of the potential problem areas with the Trump plan is that becomes harder and harder to divide Israelis from Palestinians when you have, as you look at those wide areas, each of those enclaves that would remain part of Israel. How, by the way, these 15 of these are actually within the Palestinian state itself, not just breaking it up. How you would assure the security, where the IDF would be, I think represents really pretty fundamentally hard questions to resolve. But I mention this because the Emirates looked at the Trump plan, and while they said to the Palestinians, make a counteroffer. Okay, we understand that as it is, it's probably not acceptable, but make a counteroffer. And of course, the Palestinians didn't. But when Prime Minister Netanyahu, you can take it down, I will. When Prime Minister Netanyahu said the night of January 28th, which was the day that the president presented the plan, he said, we're going to extend our sovereignty in all the areas. 30% of the West Bank would become part of Israel. And he said, we're going to extend our sovereignty in that area. And David Friedman, the American ambassador to Israel, said, yes, that's going to happen. Now, Jared Kushner, after a couple of days, and I would say with some help from a number of people, maybe including me, pointed out, the minute you do that, your peace plan will be dead. You will attract nobody else. The Arabs won't support it. They will say that this is an annexation plan, not a peace plan. And you'll kill your plan right when you presented it. If the aim is to draw others in, maybe not the Palestinians to begin with, but if you want the Arabs to embrace it, you're going to kill the possibility of that if you go ahead and you annex. Now, Jared made the decision very quickly to say, look, there's not going to be annexation. First, he said, we need to create a group to deal with our conceptual map. It's a conceptual map. It's not a real map. It has to be translated. Then he said, we need to wait for the Israeli election. Then after the Israeli election, he said, because there's a division between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the leaders of Blue-White, Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi, they need to come to an understanding on this. At the same time, he was communicating to the Palestinian Authority through Palestinian intermediaries. And you might wonder how I know this, because the same people who was using as intermediaries to the Palestinian Authority were talking to me and explaining what was going on. And he was saying to them, look, we can stop annexation until September. If you don't come in by September, then we will allow annexation to go ahead. Now, the Emiratis viewed this and felt, A, if annexation proceeds, it probably will preempt any future possibility of a two-state outcome. But B, they looked at Iran and they looked at Turkey and they said they will try to exploit any anger that might result from this, and it will make it harder for us to do what we want to do with Israel. We see developing with Israel as being in our interest. But if annexation proceeds, it's going to create a fundamental problem for us. So what they began to do, and again with some help, what they began to do was to communicate to the administration, look, if you just do annexation, it makes it difficult for all of us who would like to find a way to engage on the peace plan. That was the initial set of discussions. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu said as of July 1, he was going to proceed with bringing this to the government. Now, COVID came in as well, but he was still going to do this. And in early July, the Emiratis came to the administration, came to Jared, and basically said the following: we will fully normalize with Israel. Now, we have two conditions for it. One condition is no annexation. Annexation is off the table. And the second condition is the weapons that we've been denied to us because of America's commitment to preserving Israel's qualitative military edge, the QME. What the QME means is, this goes back, and I was actually one of the originators of this in the Reagan administration. The QME basically reflects a reality. Israel will always have militaries it's facing that are quantitatively, numerically larger than Israel's. So Israel's personnel has to be superior. Its doctrine has to be superior. The way it operates has to be superior, but so does the technology of its weapons. And the commitment to preserve Israel's QME, which began effectively in the Reagan administration and has been embraced by every successor. So, it was Bush embraced it, Bush 41, then Clinton, Bush 43, and then Obama embraced it. And so in the Trump administration, they hadn't focused much on it, but in a sense, the UAE didn't even make the effort to request certain weapons because they knew it would be denied. And this was legislation, by the way, that was adopted by the Congress in 2016. So the Emirates understood, historically, we've created two categories of Arab states that we provide arms to: those who are not at peace with Israel and those that are at peace with Israel. And so the UAE said two conditions for us to annex: one, no annexation; two, the weapons we've been denied because of QME, like the F-35 stealth aircraft, we will be allowed to get. The administration accepted that because the UAE also basically said, we're giving you a win. You will be able to show that now there's going to be another peace treaty with Israel. And so the administration saw it as a win. The UAE said it's a win for us because we see normalization as benefiting us, but also we get weapons we feel we need for our security. And even though Prime Minister Netanyahu had wanted to go ahead with annexation, obviously he could say he was able to have a third peace treaty with the UAE, which then set in motion a commitment on the part of Bahrain to do the same. Sudan has made a commitment to normalize economically. They're still not there yet on the issue of political normalization. But so that's why this took place now. And it was a UAE initiative, and the administration was smart enough to take advantage of it. Now, what does this initiative really reflect? It reflects fundamentally a readiness on the part of some Arab states to say to the Palestinians, you no longer get to define what we can do. And if that message wasn't clear enough after the UAE and Bahrain, there was what was really the equivalent of a documentary on Al Arabiya, a cable network throughout the Arab region, the Middle East. And it was led by Bandar bin Sultan, the longtime Saudi ambassador to the United States, former ambassador. And he went chapter and verse through the history, explaining how the Palestinian leaders had always made the wrong choice, always missed opportunities, were protected by the Saudis and others, and never were exposed on their mistakes, but they never learned from their mistakes. They never adjusted. And he basically said, we can no longer deny ourselves what's in our national interest because Palestinians are incapable of acting in their own interest. Now, I want to highlight for you the significance of this. What he said in public, I had heard countless times in private from Arab officials and Arab leaders. The fact that they said it in private but not in public was a reflection of their fear of how the Palestinian issue could be used against them. This is an issue that has been socialized into the minds of Arab populations since Israel's existence. And the imagery was, this is an issue of fundamental injustice. And we, the Arabs, we somehow have to help that cause be realized. The message now is we're not afraid of you arousing public sentiments against us. We're no longer going to allow you to freeze the region. We have our own set of needs. And while what the UAE did and many others did began with security concerns, because the convergence of, as I said before, the convergence of strategic threat perceptions, that may have been the initial impetus, the initial incentive for beginning to cooperate below the table, below the radar screen. But you have to understand the region is changing in terms of its economic needs. COVID-19 has only made that more acute. What are they facing? They're facing health and economic challenges because of COVID. Because of climate change and drought in the region, which is quite acute, they're facing major water problems. They're facing major food security issues. They are interested in being able to incorporate the kind of technologies that will allow them to develop digitally based economies. You have a whole series of Arab states that understand that in the aftermath of COVID, if they can't deliver more for their own publics, they may face real upheaval. And they look around and they see that Israel can be of help to them. And they're no longer willing to deny themselves that. Now, that's not true for everybody in terms of they're going to do exactly what the UAE did. But the truth is, let's take the Saudis, excuse me, as an example. I don't believe the Saudis will move in one big leap. But then again, the Emirates didn't do that either. I said they basically, over a period of 12 years, moved towards normalization, gradually getting their own public ready for it when they cross the threshold. By the way, among their 18 to 24-year-olds, they took a poll. And if you're going to face a problem, you're going to face it from the youth because they're the ones who could rise up. So they took a poll of the 18 to 24-year-olds, and they asked them what they thought of the deal with Israel. 89% supported it. 91% said others should follow their example. Now, the numbers aren't mirrored necessarily everywhere else in the region. It'll take time for others because the socialization process against Israel and for the Palestinians has been close to 70 years of just one set of messages. But the fact that the Arab League, when the Palestinian Authority went and asked them to condemn what the UAE had done, the Arab League rebuffed them. They went to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 57 Muslim countries. They said, condemn the UAE, rebuffed again. They went to the head of Al-Azhar, which is the major training area for Sunni imams in Cairo, and said, condemn them. They were rebuffed. This is a region that is changing fundamentally, and they're focused on their needs. And the Palestinians no longer are capable of denying their needs. Now, that is a big deal. And it creates a possibility for real potential, even on the Palestinian issue. And I'll explain what I mean, and then I'll wrap up and we'll open it up to whatever you want to talk about. The Arabs can do several things to make it possible to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. There have been no direct negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians since the spring of 2014. So the psychological gaps between the Israelis and Palestinians have become much worse. The substantive gaps are very wide. I often say you can bridge a stream, but you can't bridge an ocean. There is a huge gulf between them on the substance. But you can begin to change the reality, which is what is necessary. And you can use the Arabs for that purpose. First, the Arabs can create a cover for Palestinians. If at a certain point Palestinians are willing to make concessions, which goes deeply against the grain of their narrative, because their narrative is shaped by a profound sense of victimhood. I've often said about the Palestinians, one of the greatest problems they have is they adopted being a victim as a strategy, but the problem with being a victim as a strategy is it guarantees you'll always be a victim. They find it very difficult to ever rationalize a concession or a compromise. But an Arab umbrella could create a justification for them. We're doing this because our Arab brother supports this. So they can provide a cover. they can provide a basis for diplomacy. Think about what the UAE did. The UAE said, we will normalize but no annexation. They linked the issues. Israel was planning to absorb the 30% or at least some percent of the territory that was allotted to it under the Trump plan. And they said no. Now, what they did, in effect, was link it with a negative move, saying, we don't normalize if you take this step. Don't take this step, then we normalize. Other Arabs can say, as they begin a process of outreach to Israel, they can say, look, we're prepared to start a process with you. And then in the Q&A, I can give you examples of what I mean. But here's what we need you to take a step towards the Palestinians. The less politically significant the moves the Arabs make towards Israel, the more practical steps should be what the Israelis might take towards the Palestinians, much of which might be in Israel's interest anyway. The more politically significant the step, the more politically significant the step towards the Palestinians. But that is something that could be brokered. Frankly, the right approach for us right now on the Israeli-Palestinian issue is not to chase after the Palestinians, but to take advantage of and to promote continuing Arab moves towards Israel, because in the end, this is what will get the Palestinians eventually to come around. And I'm going to conclude with this thought. The Palestinians will not adjust until they see that those who have always supported them will no longer accept their positions and their position of not doing anything. Now, what we've begun to see is that happening in the Arab world. The one thing that Palestinians believe that they've achieved is international acceptance of their cause. If they believe that they're jeopardizing international acceptance, regional and international acceptance of their cause, and I often say the Arabs are not going to be more Arab than the Arabs. So if the Arabs are the ones reaching out to Israel, the Europeans are not going to suddenly reject that, number one. Number two, when you think about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, pretty hard to sustain that when basically the Arabs won't boycott Israel. It shows really the fallacy of the BDS movement. So everything I'm describing to you suggests we are dealing in a new Middle East when it comes to how Israel fits in, how others are relating to it. And last point, one of the sources of attraction of Israel also, there is a security dimension, is that there is increasing doubt about us. When President Trump talks to President Erdogan of Turkey in a phone call, then decides he's going to pull out of Syria, that makes the Arab Sunni states worry. You know, if the process of what looked like American retrenchment began under Obama, and they believe that President Trump is headed there as well, whether there's a second term for him, that he will head in that direction, or if Biden becomes the president, there's a sense that the U.S. is in a withdrawal. Its instinct is to withdraw from the region. And as they do that, or as they perceive that, they look around, they say, well, who can help us in the security area? Well, they look at the Russians and say, not the Russians, they caused the problem. Maybe we need to accommodate them somewhat, but we can't count on them for security. The Chinese, no, they're all mercantilists. They're not interested in anything except, building and preempting us with the U.S. in terms of trade relations. The Europeans, they look at the Europeans and say, the Europeans aren't going to do this. And they look around, they say, you know who can't go anywhere? Do you know who actually acts but doesn't talk about it? Israel. So the security dimension is one thing, and this whole economic dimension is another. Okay, I'll stop there. I answered everything, huh?
Edie, you need to unmute.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. Before we begin with questions, I, along with David, on behalf of Temple Beth Shalom, wish to express our sincere gratitude to Debbie and Larry Haspel for their generosity in sponsoring this program. They make our Sarasota secular community, our Jewish organizations here and in Israel, strong and secure. and this synagogue vibrant and exciting. We have been privileged to know Larry and Debbie for a long time and have never known them to use the word no. Toda rabah. So, Ambassador Ross, it seems like an eternity ago when we met in Aspen in August of 2019, where we discussed your coming to Sarasota 2 days after the 2020 presidential election, which we just don't have the answer to at this moment, to speak on the impact on American foreign policy, such as Iran, especially as it relates to the Middle East. Our 2020 vision could not conceive of what has actually transpired so far this year. On the one hand, we have had the horrific COVID-19 pandemic that has changed the world. And on the other hand, amazingly, we have what you have just talked about, the signing of the peace accords with 3 Arab countries that's changing the Middle East. By the way, I believe your wife chose the name of your latest book, Be Strong and of Good Courage. It came at a very good time when all of us are looking for some strength and a lot of courage. You have spent 35 years of your life pursuing peace between Israel and the Palestinians for 4 presidents. We know that you were instrumental in helping President Clinton develop the Clinton Parameter in December 2000, just before he left office. In January 2020, President Trump put out his vision for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, peace to prosperity. Each of these plans was designed to improve the lives of the Palestinians and the Israelis. Please help us understand how they were conceived and developed and some of the differences and similarities between them.
Okay. So when the Clinton parameters were developed, they were developed as a response to the Israelis and the Palestinians. We had spent basically the last several years negotiating with both of them, but they were negotiating with themselves. This was the most intense negotiations and diplomacy that ever took place between Israelis and Palestinians, took place during the Clinton administration. There hasn't been anything like it since, not in the Bush administration, not in the Obama administration, and not in the Trump administration. Meaning you had intense direct negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I was our negotiator. I was the lead, I basically led our effort. And I would meet with them. Sometimes they would meet just bilaterally. Sometimes I would meet with them in parallel. Sometimes we would meet the 3 of us. We had spent literally thousands of hours on what it would take to be able to reach an agreement between the 2. We still wanted them to be the ones to negotiate it, not for us to be the ones to broker it. What happened in December of 2000 was that the Israelis and the Palestinians came to Washington. I had a meeting with Yasser Arafat on December 11th of 2000, in which I basically said to him, look, I'm not going to fool you. You're not going to fool me. President Clinton is gone in 5 weeks and I'm gone with him. And he said, well, I know Clinton has to leave, but you can't leave. To which I said, I'm leaving. So, tell me what you can do. And he gave me a typical, I won't use the term I would describe to characterize it. Let's just say he gave me an answer that was a non-answer. So I said to him, I'll tell you what, I'll tell you what I think the Israelis can live with on each of the core issues, and you tell me whether you can accept it. So I went through borders, security, refugees, and Jerusalem. And he said, I can accept it. So I briefed this. We actually had this meeting in Morocco. It's a complicated set of reasons for why we did it in Morocco instead of in Ramallah or Gaza. But anyway, so I called President Clinton on a secure line. I explained what had happened, and he asked me, how come you're not more excited? And I said, because I don't believe him. I believe it's really easy when he's sitting here alone with me to say he accepts it. But I think we should test it. So why don't we, I'll brief Barack on what's just happened. And then why don't we invite the 2 sides to have their negotiators come to Washington We'll put them up at Bowling Air Force Base, which we've done before. And we'll meet with them, and let them see if they can come to an understanding based on what I've just heard from Arafat. So both teams came. I sort of framed their discussions on the Monday when they arrived, and they spent 3.5 days trying to reach an agreement among themselves. At the end of 3.5 days, the two leaders of the delegation came to me and said, we can't reach an agreement on our own. We need you to present a bridging proposal. Now, at this point, what the Clinton parameters represented was a bridging proposal in response to what the two sides had requested of us. And when President Clinton presented the proposal, this was a Thursday they asked for it, we presented it on Saturday morning at the White House. He said to the two sides, this is not American policy. This is a bridging proposal. And what I'm requiring from each of the leaders is a yes to these parameters. If you want to, what we're doing is we're shrinking the differences from being very wide to being very narrow. You go ahead and then negotiate the details that remain. But if you don't reach an agreement, then these ideas leave office when I leave office. Now, the Israeli government accepted it. Yasser Arafat, even though we mobilized the Arabs to put pressure on him, he rejected them. Just one other footnote on this, and I'll go to the Trump peace plan. I was having dinner in the city of Rawabi, which is a new city built in the West Bank. Everyone, if you have, once we can all travel again, I urge you all to go there. It would change your view of what can happen for the Palestinians, because this is an effort to build a genuine middle class and to build it around principles of coexistence. At the dinner, one of the people at the dinner was one of the Palestinians who'd been in the negotiating delegation at the White House. And he told me something I hadn't known before. This was about 18 months ago. He said, look, we on our side got together after the presentation. What was done, President Clinton presented this verbally, and then I sat with both sides, and I went over word for word what the president had presented. So they each had it exactly in writing. And he told me that they decided on their own they should accept it. But they didn't want to brief anybody back in Ramallah. They wanted to go in as a group. They had about 8 on their delegation. And they thought they would have strength in numbers if they went to Arafat and said, here's the deal that the president has presented. We think we should accept it. Now, one of the negotiators who hadn't made the trip because his brother had died was pressing to get the details of this, and he wasn't told the details, but he was given a broad brush overview and told that the group intended to recommend acceptance. Now, he went in to see Arafat and said, they're trying to get you to buy something, don't buy it. Now, Arafat took that, and when this group came in, he confronted them all and said, you're all traitors. And they melted. That was it. So anyway, this former negotiator said to me, after he recounted this, he said, can you imagine where we would be today if we had accepted the Clinton parameters? And he said this with such a deep sense of regret, almost a mournful sense of regret, given where the Palestinians are today. Okay, so that's how the Clinton parameters came about. It was a bridging proposal. The Trump plan is not a bridging proposal. It wasn't worked out with the Arabs. It didn't reflect much input from them. It reflected almost no input from the Palestinians because the Palestinians began boycotting the administration after December 2017, when President Trump made the decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move our embassy. So there was really no real effort to coordinate anything with them, but also because of fears of leaks, none of the Arab states were presented the details either. They were presented, again, generalities, but not the details. The administration, I believe, they spent 3 years developing this. They worked on it, and I know because I can tell you, they reached out to me throughout this period for my thoughts. In the end, they didn't take my thoughts on either the process or the substance, but they invested 3 years in it. And I will tell you that Jared is, and Jason Greenblatt, who was part of this, they're proud of the effort. They invested heavily in it on a personal level. They think they have presented something that is a serious proposal. And the truth is, they view it as a going in position. One of the messages that's been conveyed, I said, I know who conveys the messages because they talk to me too. One of the messages is, look, just make a counter proposal. This is an opening offer. It's like a bid. So I don't think that the Trump administration or the president views this as the end of the story. I think they've come in and this is a kind of baseline. In any event, what it reflects is a serious effort to try to create a somewhat different approach. To be fair to the administration, I think one of the things they wanted to do was to send a message to the Palestinians: every time you say no, you don't gain, you lose. And I have to say, this is a view that I've held for a long time too, which is, you heard me say it before, you want to move the Palestinians, they have to see they are losing support and no one is going to continue to support their rejectionism or their inability to respond. Because the truth is, almost every peace proposal they've either said no to or they've said no comment to. So there has to be a consequence where they don't think when they say no or no comment that somehow they'll get a better offer later on. So I was completely supportive of that part of the plan. Where I had a problem was, it was twofold. First, there are 130 settlements in the West Bank. I said before, those that would be within what I call the block areas, they represent 85% of the settlers, not 85% of the settlements. There are large numbers of small settlements. Now, there are 52 settlements within what I would call the block areas. There are 78 outside. All previous peace proposals have said we'll absorb the block areas into Israel, but we won't absorb the other 78. We never said any of them had to be dismantled, but we said if you're going to live outside of what is the state of Israel, you'll live under the Palestinian sovereignty. You can stay, but you live under the Palestinian sovereignty. And that was a distinction. Here, the Trump plan absorbs into Israel all 130. And it creates two problems. One, as I said, the number of these, I have no idea how in practice this could work, because 15 of them will be within the Palestinian state itself and yet still be part of Israel. And that creates insuperable problems from security and other legal questions. But the bigger problem of that 78 is it's hard to create separation from the Palestinians. And if you want to preserve a Jewish democratic state, you have to be able to separate Israelis from Palestinians. I would have preferred to see the Trump plan not absorb all 130 into Israel. The 52, yes, the 78, no. I would have preferred them to follow this notion that none of them has to be dismantled, nobody has to evacuate, but that you're part of the Palestinian state. Just as 20% of the Israeli population are Arabs, and they abide by Israeli law. The same could be true for Israelis. Now, the truth is, many Israelis wouldn't want that to be the case, so they would leave. But not all would leave, because some view this as a variety of different motivations for why they are where they are. Most move to the territories not for ideological reasons, but for quality of life reasons. In any case, I would have liked to have seen the settlements not all absorbed, and I would have liked to have seen the Palestinian state in symbolic terms having a border with Jordan so it didn't look like an island. There was a way to create the symbolism of a border, but not the practicality of it. I did a back channel after I left the Obama administration, in which we came up with the idea of a long-term 100-year lease, that Israel would lease the whole area along the Jordan River. So Israel would control it. Again, the concept of a security border goes back to Yitzhak Rabin way back in the time when he was prime minister the first time in the 1970s, and it was something he maintained when he was prime minister the second time in the 1990s. I would have liked to have seen that done in a way that would have made it hard for the Palestinians to say no. This made it easy for them to say no. And the truth is, there was no single Arab state that embraced this plan. The most they were prepared to say was, okay, look, the Palestinians should make a counterproposal. But no one was prepared to stand up and say, we support the plan as it is. And I can tell you, it would not have been difficult to take the plan and transform it into something that would have made it much, much more saleable from an Arab standpoint. But that required doing more coordination in advance with the Arabs and then working out with them in advance, word for word, what they would say when the plan was unveiled. Had that been done, I think you would have seen enormous pressure on the Palestinians to have to engage in the plan. Now they don't feel any pressure to engage on the plan. Maybe if there's a second Trump term, maybe they will come around and engage the Trump administration. If there isn't a second Trump term, I don't expect the Biden administration to launch a big initiative because I think they understand you can't achieve peace quickly between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I do think they will build on what the Trump administration has done in terms of these Arab state moves towards Israel. I don't think they will embrace the Trump plan per se, but I don't think they will reject necessarily every part of it.
So in your recent article in The Hill, you wrote that prior to the Clinton parameters in 2000, you briefed and discussed its contents with Bandar bin Sultan, the Saudi ambassador to the United States. You wrote that you were surprised by his response. He said, in quotes, "If Arafat rejects this, it won't be a mistake, it will be a crime." Did you have any discussion with President Clinton about disclosing Bandar's statements to the world? Did Bandar advise or reject you that you were not to speak of it? If so, can you tell us what the president had to say at that time?
Bandar wasn't prepared to say it publicly, even though what I didn't write in that article, Bandar did put pressure on Arafat. Arafat came to see President Clinton on January 2nd, 2001. And Bandar put pressure on Arafat to accept the Clinton parameters. Actually, he and the Egyptian ambassador both put pressure on Arafat to accept it. As I said to Bandar at the time, your quiet pressure is appreciated, but when you do things in public, it gets attention. When you do it in private, nobody knows. Arafat knows, but the price to Arafat is knowing that he's going to be ostracized by the Arabs if he rejects this. That was not something they were prepared to do at the time, and that's the distinction that I'm drawing for you today. What I did in my presentation was to say, we're in a different world today. What wasn't thinkable for them at that time, to look like they're prepared to challenge the Palestinians and have the Palestinians stand up and say, they're trying to sacrifice Palestinian national rights. They all were afraid that if Arafat stood up and said that it could destabilize their regimes. So what's different today is they don't have that fear. That's actually, again, one of the points I wanted to make in the presentation was to explain how different the Middle East is today from 20 years ago. And it took time to go through this. Look, it took 12 years for the Emirates to cross the threshold, even though they were pretty close before August. I mean, what I didn't mention, before COVID, the Emirates had made a decision to allow Israel to have a pavilion in Expo 2020 in Dubai. That was going to be a public pavilion. Israelis were going to be allowed to travel there on their own passports. So they were going public with their relationship. So this evolved over time. But the crossing the threshold sent an unmistakable signal. From now on, we will act in our own interest, and the Palestinians can't determine what that will be. And this is simply your question, Edie, with what existed in the year 2000, was too much of a fear of what the Palestinians could do. And our urging them to be public about it wasn't going to be sufficient, because what has always been most important for Arab leaders has been their security and their survival. What was never understood, and I wrote in my book, Doomed to Succeed, I showed how in every administration there was constantly this sense that the Palestinian issue, yes, that's the most recent book was my wife's title. This one was mine. You can, which is better. What I wrote in that book was almost every national security establishment, from Truman through Obama, and by the way, even in the first year of Trump, both Jared and Tillerson both said that the reason they were focused on the issue was because it was key to stability in the region. This notion ignored the reality that Arab leaders never made the Palestinian issue the most important issue to them in terms of their actual behavior. They didn't do much to help the Palestinians. They used the Palestinian issue. And the fact is, when it was a choice between what was in their interest and the Palestinian interest, they always chose their interest. What we're seeing is the fear is gone.
So has a little birdie told you who will be replacing Abu Mazen one day, hopefully in the near future? And does the idea that Saab Erekat asked to go to an Israeli hospital something positive?
The fact that, the good news is he's still alive. He had a lung transplant, so he was especially vulnerable to COVID-19. And again, when you're really at risk, where do you go? You go to Hadassah Hospital. It does say something, doesn't it? And it's, it says in practice and in fact. The Palestinians aren't there yet. As I said, the sense of grievance and victimhood and feeling that they're the weak party and things are owed to them, those are very old habits, very hard to break. But when the Arabs do what they're doing, it begins to change things. In answer to your question about who might follow Abu Mazen, there are different factions. I would say there's probably two different factions. I can go through all the names for you, but they won't mean a lot to you. I'll simply say there are different factions. I will tell you one of those who is a competitor, and you can assume that I know most of the competitors fairly well. One of them who's a competitor said to me when I asked him, so are you positioning yourself now? He goes, to be the leader? No. Because he said the first leader who follows Abu Mazen will fail. The second one who follows Abu Mazen will fail. The third one who follows Abu Mazen will probably fail. So I'm looking to be the fourth one. So I think they realize that there's a potential for a lot of chaos. Although I will say this, there could be real chaos, there could be upheaval, but I think the Benjamin Franklin adage will apply, meaning they realize that they'll all hang separately if they don't hang together.
So last week, I was privileged to hear from a lifelong scholar of Sudan, Ehud Yari. He spoke to members of the Washington Institute. I was eager to learn from him how little I knew about Sudan. I learned that Sudan is extremely poor, a largely barren landmass, as well as harboring terrorists like Al-Qaeda and other extreme bad actors, and apples too, and of course, an enemy of Israel. I know that in 1967 in Khartoum, the Arab League adopted the infamous 3 no's: no peace, no negotiations, no recognition of Israel. How come they decided to be redeemed? Why were they eager to have a diplomatic and peaceful relationship with their avowed enemy? Can you help us understand this complicated change of reality?
I think the place we have to start is that you had a longtime leader, Bashar, who was ousted last year. This is a guy, Omar Bashar, who was a war criminal because of how he dealt with Darfur. He was ousted and he was replaced. This was one of those civil uprisings. And you have it took a while to work out an understanding between the military and a civilian transitional government. Hamdok, who is the prime minister, is someone who was focused primarily on the need, for understandable reasons, to deal with what are their profound economic problems. They have been on the terrorism list because they harbored terrorists, Al-Qaeda among others, for so long. But this is a government that is very different. This is a government that understood that economically it has no possibility of improving things so long as it remained on the terrorism list. The terrorism list makes it impossible to get investment from outside, to get banks. Any reputable bank would run away from any possible investing, loaning, financing of projects for fear that they would be sanctioned. So once Sudan understood, its leaders understood, there was no possibility of being able to advance economically, which is where there's enormous pressure on them, unless they could get off the terrorism list. Now, the truth is they deserve to get off of it because they not only, they put Bashar in jail, they have removed others, put in jail or expelled others who were connected in any way to Al-Qaeda. They're doing this for their own reasons. It's in their interest. There still are, a lot of Muslim Brotherhood types that are in Sudan, but basically they understood nothing could change unless they got off the terrorism list. The Trump administration basically said, make peace with Israel, or at least commit to making peace with Israel, and we'll take you off the terrorism list. So that's why it happened. They got, just as, unlike in the UAE that basically was doing something for itself to stop annexation and to do a real deal with Israel because it saw gains, this was a deal between the Sudan and the United States. Now, the Sudan also, so that its leaders feared there might be a domestic upheaval or response. And the truth is there hasn't been one. Again, so many times people have predicted certain steps will produce a great backlash. And one of the things one of the reasons I wrote the book Doomed to Succeed was because there are these assumptions that have a way of living on even when the reality fundamentally invalidates them, but nobody recognizes it. And I wanted to show over time the constant set of assumptions that endured even though they were completely wrong-headed. Another example of this was the expectation that, if Sudan does this and reaches out to Israel, there's going to be this terrible backlash within Sudan. Well, there hasn't been a terrible backlash within Sudan. It doesn't mean that everybody supports it. There are signs that there is some real dissonance there, but it hasn't produced big demonstrations. It hasn't produced response. It hasn't weakened the government. And the Sudanese government realizes, just like everybody else in the region, and especially the poorer states, they have something to gain from Israel. Agriculturally, they can be of great help. And obviously on water, Southern Sudan has oil, and the rest of Sudan is facing a severe drought. And here again, what you don't understand about Israel. Israel reuses 85% of its wastewater. No other country in the world comes close to that. Italy is number 2 at 17%. Retreated wastewater obviously expands the available water you have. You can use it for agriculture. And Israel can come in and help a country like Sudan that has a desperate need to deal with water problems and food-related issues, agricultural production, and so forth. So many of these countries realize they have something profound to gain. And so I think that explains, in the end, being taken off the terrorism list and what they have to gain now from Israel explains why you've seen the move on Sudan's part. You're muted. Edie, you're muted.
Israeli intelligence minister Eli Cohen released a statement this week that he believed that 4 more Arab countries were ready to follow the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan, namely Saudi Arabia, Oman, Morocco, and Niger. some people also say Qatar, but Qatar says they're waiting for peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. However, he firmly believes that in order for those countries to sign on, the US president must be strong against Iran. What are we doing about Iran? What happens if the next president is Biden and he's offered to go back to the JCPOA? Do you believe these are the next countries and the imperative that American presidents must be strong about Iran?
I think we do have to be strong about Iran. I don't believe those countries are ready right now to normalize. I think that it's an overstatement. Saudi Arabia will move in stages. It'll be a gradual process. You will not see countries do exactly what we've seen so far of these three, with the possible exception of Oman. Oman, I think, could do it because Oman too has profound economic needs. The problem in Oman is you have a new leader. The Sultan Qaboos died, about 6 months ago. He had ruled Oman for, more than 30 years. He could have done it. He had the authority to do it and couldn't have been questioned. You have a new Sultan in Oman, and he will be more careful in terms of moving towards Israel. But I do believe if we were to do this again within a year, I think Oman will have moved by that time. I think Saudi Arabia will move in stages. I think Morocco will move in stages. Niger is not an Arab country. It is a Muslim country, but not an Arab country. Qatar, for the reasons you said, won't do it, but for other reasons too. Qatar is very close to Turkey, and Turkey is one of the leading critics of this. Kuwait won't do it anytime soon. But the other countries you mentioned, they will move gradually. Now, in Morocco, Iran is not the issue for Morocco. Western Sahara is the issue for Morocco. The Saudis and the Emiratis will look at what the US does towards Iran, and that will have a huge effect, for sure. Now, today, the Iranians have 10 times the amount of low-enriched uranium on hand, which is could be the core of a bomb, than they had at the time that they implemented the JCPOA. President Trump has been very tough on Iran in terms of maximum economic pressure, but they've also walked away from the limitations of the JCPOA, and we don't really have a substitute for that right now. If Biden becomes president, what he's saying is he'll offer compliance for compliance. That will not be a simple negotiation. Let me explain why. Biden will not lift the sanctions until there's compliance. Now, the problem is that the Iranians are going to come in and say, you owe us. They're going to ask for sanctions relief before they comply again. Now, some of the restrictions that they've walked away from the JCPOA will take some time and expense to undo. As I said, they have 10 times the amount of low-enriched uranium on hand now because they've been accumulating it since they began to walk away from the deal. They will either have to dilute that so that it change the character of it, or they have to ship it out, and that will take some time. They have installed 2 cascades of advanced centrifuges 5 years ahead of time. These centrifuges are 10 to 20 times as efficient as the centrifuges they use to enrich their uranium. It's not only they're 5 years ahead of time, and they now have built a new knowledge base. It's that here again, they will have to dismantle these. It takes some time. They are enriching in Fordow, which is what they're not supposed to do. This is basically a mountain that they build an enrichment site in. Again, they have to dismantle. So it'll take some time before you could even get to the point where the Biden formula of compliance for compliance could take place. Will that happen before the Iranian election in June? I don't know. It depends on how much the supreme leader feels that they're hurting. Maybe it'll happen, maybe not. Maybe they'll do a more limited deal, a kind of a freeze for a freeze, where there's much more limited kinds of relief given to them. The bigger question is this: what will the Biden administration do about Iran's behavior in the region? we haven't done much towards that. Yes, we killed Qasem Soleimani. The Iranians haven't slowed down one bit anything they're trying to do in Syria. They haven't slowed down one bit their effort to build and put precision-guided capabilities on 150,000 rockets that Hezbollah has. They are insinuating Hezbollah on the border next to Israel in the Golan Heights. That's continuing. The Israelis are trying to counter that. We're not doing anything about that. What they're doing, the support they give the Houthis in Yemen hasn't slowed down one bit. What matters from the standpoint of the Gulf states is, what are we going to do on that? And here I would say the Biden administration is going to have to come to grips with that. The Trump administration has not. It basically allows the Israelis to do what they're doing. It doesn't really have an answer for the other things that the Iranians are doing. And I would suggest that a Biden administration, if it wants to go back into JCPOA, compliance for compliance is one thing, but there's something else. Even if you go back to the JCPOA, we will end up, I would predict right now, if there's a Biden administration, we will end up sanctioning the Iranians for what they're doing in the region. And the minute we do that, the Iranians will cry foul. And then whatever you've got will fall apart. So even if they want to go back into the JCPOA, if there isn't a parallel strategy for dealing with what the Iranians are doing in the region, it won't be sustainable. I'll put it this way. I have confidence there will be people around Biden who will understand that. Now, what the decision will be, we'll have to see. First, we don't know if he's going to be president. And secondly, we'll have to see who he has around him. I do think Biden's own instinct is to be a unifier and to work across party lines. That, too, I think will influence what is done on Iran. I think he will work very hard to reach out to the Republicans on the Hill, because I think it's part of his sense of how he heals the nation in the aftermath of this bruising polarization and campaign. And that, I think he will make an effort to say, look, we agree on the objectives towards Iran. I mean, they can't have a nuclear weapon. They shouldn't destabilize the region. Now, we may disagree on the means we use to try to achieve that, but let's talk about this. So the more that happens, again, the more I have some confidence that they will come up with a strategy for dealing with what Iran does in the region. You need to deal with both. You can't deal with one and not the other. I think the Trump administration had hoped by squeezing the Iranians economically, they would be forced to come back into negotiations on the one hand, and they wouldn't have the resources to fund their troublemaking in the region. And the problem is they're providing less, but they're still providing it. To give you an example, they used to give close to $1 billion a year to Hezbollah. Well, that's probably back to 500 million, but it's still 500 million. Hamas in Gaza, they're still one of the bigger funders of Hamas in Gaza. You know, when it comes to making their own public sacrifice, the Iranians don't seem to have a problem. And the question becomes, you know, how do you create the right kind of pressure on them? Because the Iranians will never be induced into agreeing to something. They have to be pressured into it. The challenge is, how do you do it in a way that not only squeezes them economically, but also isolates them politically? And you know, this will be the challenge. Frankly, it'll be the challenge for a Trump administration if there's a second Trump term. And it'll be the challenge for the Biden administration if there's a Biden administration.
Well, do you think that selling these products like F-35s to the Sunni nations would help stop the Iranians from being so aggressive?
The short answer is no, because the way they don't do it conventionally, they don't do it through conventional arms. Look how they do it. They use drones, they use cruise missiles. What they're trying to do in Lebanon is to create factories that will produce precision-guided capabilities to put on the rockets. They put it there. They do the same thing with the Houthis, and they ship weapons to them. They like to do it through indirection. They're not going to go ahead and, except with one exception, when they they did carry out a cruise missile drone strike against the most important oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia. But they, of course, denied they did it. And when we didn't do anything in response to it, the Saudis then were reluctant to blame them publicly, because then it would require the Saudis to react militarily. So from the Emirati standpoint, they want it because they think it deters the Iranians from doing things more directly against them. But they have some other leverage on Iran. Believe it or not, even though the Emiratis are created this relationship with Israel, which is quite profound and very meaningful, and really is extraordinarily promising. Even though that's the case, a lot of the business that Iran does is done in Dubai. And one of the reasons that the Iranians really don't go after the Emiratis is because they put that at risk. So there's a kind of duality. The F-35s, creating deterrence. But the F-35s have a limit in terms of utility against the kind of threats that the Iranians pose.
So we're coming to the end. I know you're exhausted. Turkey is one of the most important and powerful countries in the Middle East. We haven't spent much time on Turkey. Under President Erdogan, it has become very aggressive on many fronts. The foreign minister of UAE last week equated Turkey's troublemaking to Iran's. Turkey is a member of NATO, but is buying military systems from Russia. It is militarily active in Syria and Libya and is challenging NATO members Greece and Cyprus, and is also belligerent against Israel. What should the United States administration do to counter this aggression?
This is probably the hardest question you've asked me.
The best for the last.
Yeah, and the reason is for the very reasons you said in your question. They're both a member of NATO. They have an extraordinarily important strategic position because they border Russia, they border Europe, they border the Middle East. So this is a geostrategically central country. It is a country of 90 million people. Half the population of Turkey is anti-Erdogan. I think the challenge here is for us to create a relationship that preserves the possibility of a genuine alliance after Erdogan. Erdogan is is an authoritarian leader. He's not a democratic leader. But as I said, half the country is alienated from him. He becomes more aggressive on the outside as the Turkish economy becomes more problematic on the inside. So I think the challenge for us is to create a set of boundaries where we draw the line, and basically where he does things and he crosses a line, we have to be prepared to impose a price on him. We want to try to do that in a way that still recognizes he has his own interest in preserving a relationship with us. He competes today with Russia in Syria, in Libya. And that means that he doesn't want to be left alone vis-a-vis the Russians. So that gives us some leverage. We're going to have to use our leverage. We're going to have to try to, as I said, resist him where he needs to be resisted and try to preserve a relationship for the post-Erdogan period. Turkey is too important a country to write off, but he is a leader who both confounds us and confronts us with real challenges, and we can't wish him away. Look, he is basically, his party, the AKP party, is an Islamist party. He supports the Muslim Brotherhood. He gives passports to the military wing of Hamas. He is not a friend. He's kind of what they all say. He's a frenemy. And we're going to have to figure out a way to balance what are longer term interests with what are shorter term challenges.
So I'm going to ask you from a very young new member in our community, Josh Mellitz, who's the director of the Jewish National Fund in Western Florida, a wonderful young man, and I commend everyone who doesn't know about Jewish National Fund to give him a call me. As a millennial Jewish young professional, what is your perspective on the prevailing narrative that my generation has a weak or apathetic connection to Israel?
Well, I also co-chair something called the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. And we deal with all sorts of, this is an institute that does work on how to ensure that Israel and the Jewish world thrive. And one of the challenges is the kind of loss of identity, loss of connection. Look, most of the people in this Zoom call were socialized by a series of different events. Some by the Holocaust, others by all the wars that Israel has fought. These were socializing events. For me, I was in college during the Six-Day War, and it's what triggered my lifelong interest in Israel and the region. And these were kind of crucibles that created a strong sense of identity. There, for the younger generation of, especially American Jewry, they don't have that equivalent, and they see criticism of Israel as becoming, very widespread. So I think part of the challenge is to remind younger Jews of, in a sense, how did Israel become the startup nation? Why is it that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East? For those, by the way, who want to challenge Israel and question its democracy, there is no other country in the Middle East where the chief law enforcement officer in the country would indict the prime minister. There is no one where the rule of law so applies, and Bibi may not like this, but the fact of the matter is he's been indicted by an attorney general who he appointed, following a police investigation by a commissioner of police that he appointed. They were people from the right side of the political perspective, but the spectrum. Israel is a democracy, the only one in the region. One of the things to do is to talk about what Israel actually is. Where Palestinian gays go? They go to Tel Aviv because they're not safe in the Palestinian Authority, or certainly in Gaza. Tell the story of what Israel is. And, it's okay to be critical of those policies that Israel has. I mean, that's, there's nothing wrong with that. They have a very vibrant democracy where they don't hold back their own criticisms. So where you have criticisms, it's okay to make them, but it's not okay to dismiss that Israel built itself in an environment that was almost insuperable. It built itself in an environment where it was completely rejected by all of its neighbors, where it faced constant terror attacks, where it absorbed, within the first 3 years of its existence, 1 million Jews from the Arab world who came with nothing because they were allowed to take nothing. They built in a completely inhospitable, threatening environment, and they've become a cutting-edge country. And the great irony is it is now the Arabs who now want to link up with them because they see what Israel has to offer. This is the beginning of the real flowering of what Israel represents. And I think, what you hear in me is a sense of pride. And all of us should have that pride when it comes to Israel. And I think part of our challenge as an older generation is to impart that sense of pride in the younger generation, but also point out to them, even if they have questions about the government of Israel's policy, they have a counterpart in Israel. They have a very progressive population, in parts of that population. You want to link up with somebody in Israel, whatever your political perspective is, you have a counterpart there. And again, what does that tell you about Israel? It is a lively democracy. It's going through its own period of polarization, just like we are. Many democracies around the globe are dealing with polarization. We collectively will have to overcome this, but we can't lose sight of who we are. We are countries that are based in the rule of law. We are countries that believe in peaceful change. We are countries that have elections, in our case, regularly scheduled elections, in Israel's case, not regularly scheduled elections, but it is the elections who determine who is the leader. It's also the reason that we should celebrate our elections and not question them. The minute we begin to doubt our own elections, we change who we are.
So yesterday was the 25th anniversary, hard to believe, of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. You were very close to him. Can you share some memories?
Yes, I can. I will say this about him. And I did a number of recent videos on this. First thing I'll say about him, he was the most intellectually honest leader I ever dealt with. And I can say this without qualification. He is the only leader that I ever worked with, and certainly this applies to those I work for, who would say to me that I was right and they were wrong. Rabin was the most analytical leader I ever dealt with. If he had thought something through, you had no possibility of moving him. You couldn't budge him. But if you argued against him and that he was wrong and he didn't budge him, if sometime later it turned out that your arguments were right and he was wrong, he'd come back and say, you know what? You were right and I was wrong. And I'll just give you one example of this. At the beginning of the first Intifada, which was the end of 87, beginning of 88, he was a defense minister in Israel and he came to the United States. And I was on, this is when Reagan was president, and I was in the White House on the National Security Council staff. And so I was handling the Middle East. And so he came for a meeting. Colin Powell was then the National Security Advisor. He came for a meeting. It was the three of us. And he said to Powell, look, this will be over soon. The Palestinians will, we'll crack down. These riots, they'll stop soon. And I said, I think you're wrong. I don't think so. I think there's a high level of frustration there. I told him I had traveled throughout the West Bank a couple months before, and I found a very different mood than I'd seen earlier. And I think you're not paying attention to the level of frustration. And he said to me, Dennis, you're wrong. I know the Palestinians, they won't sustain this. A couple months later, I saw him and he changed his view and he came up to me and he said, you were right and I was wrong. Now, I've never, as I said, I've had some leaders say to me, I was wrong because I listened to you, but I haven't had them say to me, you were right and I was wrong. But Rabin was intellectually honest. He was always honest with himself. He was a man of enormous courage. I mean, it's hard to, it's hard to sort of exaggerate that. This was a guy who, as a kid, basically leads. He becomes a brigade commander. He is a guy who organizes the convoys to break the siege of Jerusalem. Then he becomes a defender of Jerusalem. Because of him, they're able to preserve West Jerusalem. And if he'd been given what he asked for, he probably could have saved East Jerusalem. But what he wanted to do, he wasn't given the responsibility for East Jerusalem. A different commander was. And he objected to the plan that was employed. He was right. They were not right. In any case, he wanted to leave the military. What's not known is he wanted to be an agronomist. He wanted to be a hydraulic engineer. He actually created on the balcony. He had not the balcony, but on the roof. He had a rooftop garden. He lived on Rav Ashi Street in Ramat Aviv, and they had a rooftop. They had a rooftop garden, and he himself installed an irrigation system in this garden. And he once showed it to me with enormous pride. And he said, that's what I wanted to do. He won a scholarship to UC Berkeley. When he was finishing school in Palestine, because this is Palestine, it's pre-Israel. But Yigal Allon said, you can't take it because we need you here. And he never, and he stays in the military because one of the things that stayed with him forever, he felt an enormous responsibility for everybody who served under him. He lost dead, not wounded, half of his brigade in the War of Independence, and it never left him. He stayed in the military because he felt he owed a debt to them. He never wanted the military to be as unprepared as they were in the War of Independence. He felt a responsibility when he was the prime minister. He felt a responsibility for every single soldier. And one of the things he would say, one of the reasons he was making the effort on peace is he felt whenever he looked in the eyes of a parent who lost their soldier, their child, he wanted to be able to say, we had to use force and we went to war, not because we leaped into it, but because we exhausted every option short of it. He wanted to be able to be credible in terms of saying that. The very last words he said to me, still haunt me because it was 3 days before the assassination. And he said to me, expect anything. What he was getting at is, look, we're in a time where things are changing. They can change for the better, but they can change for the worse. And he said, expect anything. And I can tell you, the one thing I didn't expect is that he'd be assassinated 3 days later.
He was quite a mensch. Unfortunately, our time together has ended, Ambassador. You have covered so many important aspects of our election and the current situation in the Middle East and more. You've answered so many provocative and interesting questions from our audience. We are grateful to have you here via Zoom. Definitely next time it'll be in person. As Debbie said when she opened this program, we thank everyone here tonight for caring about you and what you've done and has taught us. I encourage congregants as well as guests to participate in our upcoming events, which are listed on TBS's website. Now this I'll get wrong, www.templebethshalom with 2 O's, fl.org. We wish each of you well, and hopefully we can come together in person very soon. Shalom.